This past summer, I tried writing an article that was tentatively titled, "I Want to Mourn for Gaza." And the first line of this article was, "I want to join with all the good people around the world and mourn for the devastation of Gaza." This article intended to reflect two contradictory emotions. The first was grief. Grief not only at the devastation, but grief at having been forced in defending myself to inflict devastation on my neighbors. And the second emotion that I had hoped this article would convey was anger. Anger at the criminalization of Israel. And that word criminalization is what was running through my mind all summer. I think we've lost the linguistic battle for demonization. No one knows, no one outside of our circle seems to know what that means. But it is the criminalization of Israel. And in that process of criminalizing Israel, there was no room for my grief because I was the criminal. And perhaps it'll come as no surprise to people here, but that article never got past the first paragraph. I couldn't get the tone right. It either came across as falsely sympathetic or excessively angry. And so I simply laid it aside. Why was it so hard for me to come to terms with my grief? Why is it so hard for so many of us to acknowledge our grief? And I think one reason is because our enemies don't want our grief, they want our confession, our surrender. Ashamnu, bagadnu, I have massacred, I have stolen, I have expelled, I have besieged. What our enemies expect of us is not grief, but confessing that our entire story is one big lie, and that Zionism was born in original sin. This summer, as you are all painfully aware, the moral divide separating most of Israeli society and large parts of the liberal diaspora grew even more perceptible. On our side, 95% of Israeli Jews, according to one poll I saw, supported the war, believed that it was a just war that was fought justly. And I don't know if there were any polls taken in diaspora communities, but certainly the numbers would be much lower, at least in the American Jewish community. One fact from this summer really, for me, sums up the growing problem we have in Israeli diaspora relations. Does anyone here know where the largest pro-Israel demonstration during the war was held? Anyone want to venture a guess? Sydney, Toronto, New York. It was in a city without Jews, Calcutta. Calcutta had a demonstration of several tens of thousands of Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists marching in favor of Israel's war against terror. There was a bigger demonstration in the United States during the war. 40,000 people marched in Washington, but for the other side. Now, think about that for a moment. The largest demonstration in America of solidarity during the war was with Gaza. So those, I think, are some milestones, deeply worrying milestones that are worth our attention. Why is the Palestinian issue so deeply divisive for the Jewish people? what does this do to our collective soul? I believe that Jewish history presents our generation in particular with two non-negotiable demands. And these non-negotiable demands can each be summed up by a particular biblical commandment. The first commandment is to remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And the message of that commandment is don't be brutal. The second commandment is remember what Amalek did to you when you were leaving Egypt, looking for water, and were attacked without provocation. Remember that you live in a world in which genocide is possible. And the message of that biblical commandment is don't be naive. Our tragedy is that these two non-negotiable biblical commandments to our generation converge on the Palestinian problem. Because the stranger in our midst, the stranger we are occupying, is also the stranger who wants to dispossess us, to inherit us. That is the dilemma of the Jewish soul. Now, left and right each appropriated one of these biblical commandments and in effect placed that commandment on its banner. What that means is that both left and right are each upholding an indispensable Jewish value, and yet left and right on their own are each inadequate, incomplete. A majority of Israelis seem to have intuited this, and after many years of being divided into pretty much two equally strong camps, left and right, a majority of Israelis today are a little bit left and a little bit right at the same time, in effect, centrists. Every poll of the last decade or more has shown that a majority of Israelis believe two things about a Palestinian state. One is that it is an existential need for Israel, and the other is that it is an existential threat for Israel. The left won the argument over the disastrous consequences long-term for the Jewish people of occupying another people, and they won that argument in the first Intifada in the late 1980s. The right won the argument about the disastrous consequences of a self-delusional peace process with a Palestinian national movement which doesn't recognize our legitimacy in any borders and in any of the Palestinian national movement's factions. And the right won that argument in the second Intifada. Most Israelis today are a combination of these two insights which we learned the hard way successively in the first Intifada and then the second. A centrist holds both of these insights simultaneously. A centrist internalizes the Jewish schism so that it is no longer happening just out there between two rival political and moral camps, but is being fought very deeply within each of us. And the way that I would put it as a centrist, really I would say a card-carrying centrist. I've been voting for centrist parties that couldn't get into the Knesset 20 years ago. I have two fears about a Palestinian state. The first is that there won't be a Palestinian state, and the status quo will continue indefinitely, and we will become mired ever deeper in settlement building in places where we should not be building settlements, more and more isolated around the world, and the schism within the Jewish people will become, God forbid, irreparable. That's one nightmare. My second nightmare is that there will be a Palestinian state, and that what happened to Ashkelon and more urgently in Sderot will, God forbid, become the fate of the Israeli heartland, and that we will not be able to adequately defend ourselves. So the question then becomes, how do we maintain a conversation among ourselves that has integrity? How do we hold these two parts of ourselves? And this, I think, is an especially urgent question for diaspora Jews. I spent about 5 months in this past year going on the road in the American Jewish community, speaking virtually every day to a different community around the country on promoting my last book. And what I often felt as I went from a young Israel in the 5 towns to a liberal synagogue in San Francisco was that I was experiencing a kind of a time warp. For Orthodox American Jews, it is still the 1970s and the 1980s, and the first Intifada has never happened. And all we need to do is assert our right to the land, and somehow the Middle East will fall into line. For liberal Jewish communities, it's the 1990s. And all we have to do is just find that precise formula of compromise and have the courage to sign and make peace, as if the second Intifada never happened. And so when I contemplate the future of Israeli diaspora relations, I feel that the problem is, in some sense, a time lag between what we experience here and what we manage to convey to the diaspora. Now, in order to begin creating a Jewish conversation that would have integrity, that would, on the one hand, acknowledge the moral complications that we face with the occupation, and on the other hand, would confront those who would seek to criminalize the Jewish people, I would suggest that we begin creating parallel Jewish conversations, 2 ways of speaking about the conflict. The first is public, how we speak to those who seek to criminalize us. And there, the message is very simple. The Jewish people refuses to play the role of the symbol of the world's evil. We're through playing that role. Not in this world, not in this region, not when one looks around and sees what's happening on our borders. Among ourselves, we need to strengthen a moral conversation, in which, in our own internal conversation, it doesn't matter what Assad is doing to his own people. What matters is the state, the condition of the Jewish soul. And when we speak among ourselves, we need to ask ourselves very hard questions. How is it possible that Jews could have kidnapped a 16-year-old Arab boy and burned him alive? If any of us had been asked before that event, is it conceivable that Jews, any kind of Jews, would be capable of that? My sense is we all would have said, not that. And so we are at a place today in our history where we have completely lost our innocence as a people. These are 2 parallel conversations that we need to nurture. The problem in Jewish discourse is that left and right very often confuse these 2 conversations. So, for example, left-wing NGOs, Israeli NGOs, will appear regularly at the UN Human Rights Council and treat that and other international forums as places that are worthy of Jewish angst over the occupation. The left needs to be far more discerning in which arenas are worthy of our spiritual and moral struggles. The right, for its part, tries very often to suppress an internal Jewish conversation about our moral health. And how often have you heard from right-wing friends, oh, well, look what Assad is doing. When I'm having an internal Jewish conversation, I really don't want to hear about what Assad is doing to his own people. I want to hear what we are doing to ourselves. If we manage to maintain, to nurture a complex moral conversation, if we manage, on the one hand, to assert our right to defend ourselves without apology, without squeamishness, to look at the devastation that we caused this summer, without averting our gaze, and with all of the pain for the devastation, to say, I had no choice, and in a similar situation, I will do it again, because that's the only way to survive in the Middle East. And at the same time, to look at the moral state of the Jewish people and say, where are we? How is it possible that some parts of the Jewish people have fallen to this state? And if we manage to nurture that kind of a dual conversation, then I believe we will begin to restore something of our credibility, not only in the international community, but far more importantly, with ourselves and with our own young people. Thank you very much.